Morning, YouTube. Today I'm going to discuss this article a friend sent to me titled, "You're Not Addicted to Technology." The word addicted being in quotes. This article is by Jason Feifer. Just looking at this page, I couldn't find a date of when it's published, but it seems to be pretty recent. Now, I found this article itself very interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, I will say that this article seems very self-aware in the sense that the author brings up a lot of good points, observations. So, for example, towards the end of the podcast, the author's asking questions about when you have news stories and stuff talking about addiction. You could ask these questions of who is telling these stories and why. Now, I think this is a very good question to ask a lot of the time about different media things that you hear. Like, what is this movie trying to illustrate? What is this article trying to suggest to me? Are they trying to sell me a product? Are they trying to get me to vote a certain way? So if you ask that sort of question, you might quickly find yourself being labeled as undesirable in society. But I think let us give credit where it is due. I think that the author of this article, Mr. Jason Feifer, did correctly bring up that point. So with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about Jason Feifer, who he is, and what sort of parties he represents. So I just really quick looked at the About section by him. So it seems, he's a big media guy. He's a editor-in-chief of this entrepreneurship magazine. But perhaps more relevant to this particular article is the sorts of people he consults and who he talks about. So some of these names that he was mentioning here sounded familiar to me from other podcasts, namely the Waking Up with Sam Harris podcast, which I've talked about a couple times on this channel. So just bring that up. So let's look at the Waking Up with Sam Harris podcast, because I think that you could look at these various circles. You could call them, circles, web rings, whatever you want to call them, of people that tend to have related programs. They support each other's work. They talk about similar things. So Sam Harris, he has this podcast called Waking Up, and one of the big things that he tries to promote is this kind of secular morality. I put secular in quotes because you would call these spiritual practices and stuff, but Sam Harris, he proclaims himself to be an atheist. At least he's done this in books and stuff. I don't know what he actually believes. Anyway, so here we have explore mindfulness, Jong-chun, Advaita, and other meditation practices. So he has like a meditation app. You could see Stoic wisdom, stuff like this. So there's this whole circle of people that are trying to optimize the brain, optimize productivity in various sorts of ways. Sam Harris being one of them. And then Justin Feifer, you could see with this entrepreneurship magazine. And then you could look at what sort of products he sells. So he has a course, and here's how he markets it: how to future-proof your career and life. So download this free audio training and master the skills to confidently navigate change and build a more resilient tomorrow. So a lot of these people, you could say that they're promoting a sort of futurist, optimistic, dare I say progressive program, thinking about how we could use science and technology and all these things to progress society forward. So there's a couple other people that are mentioned in this Feifer article that I would like to bring attention to. So the Feifer, the author of the thing I'm mainly talking about, he alludes to this guy, Noah Yuval Harari, who I've mentioned at least a few times on my channel here. And this fellow, Yuval Noah Harari, is well known for being an open transhumanist proponent. I think he works at Google now, and he gives all these talks related to how humans could transform themselves. So let's just look at this tagline here he has on the site. Quote, history began when humans invented gods and will end when humans become gods. So another time we could talk about, this Gnostic idea of theosis and salvation through knowledge and all these things. I'm not going to talk about that here, but just to say that there is a kind of program that people in the circle that I'm associating Jason Feifer with have. Okay, and then another fellow he brings up is this guy, Jaron Lanier, I think is how it's spelled. Yeah, so then this guy is supposed to be like the chill hippie tech guru, I guess, that he will talk about like maybe more sort of sensitive human sounding things. So he's a big dude with dreadlocks, as you could see. Anyways, if you go around on the internet and stuff, you could find all sorts of videos of him doing like stuff. Like here he is. He likes to play various different musical instruments. So this fellow, Jason Feifer, he belongs to a circle of a lot of these people that advocate similar approaches. Okay, so getting into the content of this "You're Not Addicted to Technology" article. As I said, I think that this article, it brings up a lot of good points. One of the first points it brings up is when you have headlines or people are bringing up words, you should actually look at what they mean by the words that they're using. Don't just say, people are addicted to technology, and then assume that you know what they're saying by that. Instead, look at what they mean by addicted. So Feifer goes into some history and looks at how what we might call in modern times addicted has been discussed in various ways in the past. So he brings up, for example, this idea of like reading mania, where I think it was in the 19th century, something like that, you would have medical practitioners, psychologists, I don't know what exactly they called them in this period, but you would have documented written cases of people describing behaviors that, they were documented because at least somebody thought that they were problematic in some sense. And let's see what else. Right. So I think that, in this podcast too, then the Feifer also correctly brings up other big points about jargon. So medicalized language, I think, is the phrase he hears. So when we think of addiction, oftentimes the first thing that people might associate it with is like drug addiction, so a particular substance. So Feifer does a relevant look into the term addiction, and he goes into the DSM-5, so one of these psychologic diagnosis things, and he points at this historic event where addiction for substance is now categorized in a similar way as addiction to gambling, which is a behavior. So substance, behavior, we used to think of them as different, now we're looking at them as the same. So a lot of details about various things that I'm not going to get into. I'm not a licensed psychologist or anything like that. I'm just reviewing this article. So listen to the podcast and check out the sources if you do want to learn more about that. But to get this general point across, I don't even think you need to look at that. So a general point to look at is how various characterizations, categorizations, all this stuff is going to categorize the discussion of mental and psychological things generally. And naturally, as we have new forms in which we see stuff, then people might try to find new and different criteria for things. For example, how might you talk about addiction to alcohol, right? You could try to go on some subjective criteria where it's like someone saying, I am addicted, then you use that as your bar. Or probably people that are trying to be more scientific in the sense of measuring something that could be externally measured, not just looking at survey data or something. They might look at something chemical. So say, we count addiction as blood level, this or that, or something. The point of all this is to say, whenever you have rhetoric, language that's using technical terms like addiction or something like that, then before taking the results of a study or something like that and saying, oh yes, well science shows because study this and that, look at the methodology of the article, look at the definitions and stuff that are being used if you truly want to glean some knowledge from such a thing. And I think that in this article, rightly so, there's a lot of discussion about various different uses of stuff. All right. So, a lot of good observations, I think, in this article. Now I'm going to get to a bit more of the criticism. So, you could talk about all sorts of problems in society, and you could say, oh, it's complicated. What we need is more nuance, complicated nuance. And record hours and hours of podcasts and YouTube videos talking about complicated and nuanced. But where does that go? So you talk about all these problems and stuff. What is the solution that you're aiming for? What sort of goal do you have? So with respect to technology, addiction, all these sorts of things, you could ask the question, what is the sort of behavior that you want people to do? What do you want yourself to do? Because if you can't define that, if you don't know what your target is, what you're going for, then how are you going to be able to decide what's a problematic behavior and what is not a problematic behavior? If you don't have any standard by which you're trying to make your life better towards, then, what could you say? So there's a number of interesting little revealing tidbits, I think, that came out in this article that were, suggesting what this might be. So one of the interesting places you could see it in this article is in what the various advertisements throughout the article are for. So let's see, at 10 minutes and 15 seconds, there was a mention of a podcast by Atlassian. So it's a big tech company. So you could assume, this is a pretty tech positive kind of article. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with being interested in technology. So that's not a bad thing per se. Here we have an advertisement for this service called Blinkist, which will pull up. Blinkist. And what this service does is it summarizes nonfiction books. And if you know anything about a lot of nonfiction books, well, they'll tend to publishers publish certain types of books. In this case, like I was mentioning, this ring of people like Sam Harris, Ezra Klein, Noah Yuval Harari, all these people, they all have published books. So he's advertising the sort of app that you would go to hear summaries of these people's books and get more of these people's thoughts. So apparently people like transhumanists, Noah Yuval Harari and stuff, have a vision, or Jaron Lanier, right, of what it means to be a better sort of person. They have the positive goal in mind, such that if you're going to them for wisdom, looking at them for to hear their voice for a long time, then apparently you're trying to learn something from them. So they're kind of the wise, quote unquote, scientific priesthood of sorts. Okay, and then some other ads that were interesting here. Where did I go? Okay, yeah. So the Jason Feifer, he mentioned one of his ads. I forgot the actual thing was for, but he was talking about how he's interested in this course called How to Train Your Brain for Happiness. So if you're already like happy, and I'll use that in the sense of you're a person that's at peace with the world, doesn't mean you don't have any problems, you don't suffer. Like, I'm not defining happiness as the absence of any pain. Don't think that is how things work. But it's like, how do you... These are the sorts of ads that are being shown in this course. So, or that sort of ads that are being promoted here. The person that's writing this is interested in looking at stuff for how to be happy. So what you see is a podcast that's rightfully pointing out a lot of issues about how we do psychology, how we talk about how people's psychology works, such as the word addiction. And also we see a lot of good points about how to critically look at stuff. For example, say, who are the people that are telling you things and what are they trying to tell you? But then the article itself, right, it comes from a particular place, and it is also trying to sell you a narrative, so to speak. And the sort of narrative that it's trying to sell you is this kind of progressive, techno-utopian, transhumanist type of agenda, where it's like, oh yeah, together if we use technology and have wise leaders and this sort of stuff and make sensible policies, we could guide humanity to be better. Now, simultaneously with doing all this, a phrase that comes up throughout this whole article is coping mechanisms or coping strategies. So the article goes into details about how technology, for example, a person might escape into a video game, play a lot of video games, listen to a lot of podcasts, do a lot of YouTube, whatever you're looking at, in order to cope with some external thing. So maybe the examples given in this article would be like anxiety, depression, these sorts of things, which are, I would say, equally hard to define terms, along with addiction. So that's a whole nother rabbit hole. I'm not going to get into it. But basically, these would all be states that one would call not being happy, right? So people that are not happy in various capacities, then they go to coping mechanisms, such as using a lot of social media and stuff in order to deal with like various pain, stuff that is hard to deal with. So I just want to bring this back full circle and then bring up this point. So this podcast article, it's sponsored by technology companies. It's pushing a certain technological positive narrative, and you could explore the circle of people that are featured in this podcast. And then it's talking about how you could position yourself to do better in this world. So what did I have? Yeah, so like the end thesis punchy point of this article was we should not have learned helplessness, right? We shouldn't just say addiction happens to us. These companies do stuff to us, and then we have no agency. Instead, we should take control of what we can do and live better. So I think that general message, that sounds fine to me. But then the question is, in what capacity do you want to do it? So ultimately, this podcast site, it seems like the main objective of it is to train people to operate within what French author Jacques Ellul calls the technological society. Check out my stream for more on that if you're interested in learning about the technological society and sort of how specialization, technique, and all these things characterize your society. All right, end of unpaid advertisement. Going back to the general point, right? So this podcast is promoting this sort of technical type of world. I mean, the guy is the editor-chief person of Entrepreneur Magazine, and he's being sponsored by like tech companies, tech startups. So this is the sort of circle he's in. Now, are we surprised that all sorts of people are miserable within this world? such that they're running around looking for podcasts on happiness and stuff. It's a big question, I think, that could be important to ask. I'll just end this little blurb here that I'm making with a little anecdote from my life. So, before doing YouTube, I did blogs, writing, mostly for myself. I didn't publish a lot of things. One of the things I wrote about was how boredom has been helpful for me. So, if you're going to school or studying something and it's boring, and then you think for a second, maybe this isn't something wrong with me, but instead maybe the boredom that I'm experiencing, it is trying to teach me something. And I think that, yes, instead of just saying, why am I bored? I shouldn't be bored. I should be interested in these things. Shouldn't I want to do this task because it's important, and so on and so forth. Taking a step back and saying, yeah, like a lot of the times the stuff they ask you to do in school and all this, it is boring. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But if you take some time instead to pause, be quiet, and to contemplate upon what is this boredom and what is it trying to tell you, instead of jumping into finding these coping mechanisms or some sort of distraction. And this article too, it rightly points out, I think, that a lot of the time people are using social media and stuff. The reason is to find some kind of distraction. So you go on Twitter or something because you don't want to address some problem. So if you just have some noise going on, you could look at that. But if instead immediately seeking this distraction, looking for the coping mechanism, saying, oh yeah, I'm not addicted to my phone anymore because whenever I think about going on my phone, now I have a plan where I'm just obsessively like going to the gym or something, which might be better for your health in some ways, but still, are you solving the underlying problems of finding peace or whatever you're trying to do? So, yes, this has been a rather rambling video, but I did want to respond to the friend who sent me this article podcast, and yes, very interesting. It's Thanksgiving in the United States. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody, and until next time.